Yeah, don't worry about it. Well, thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me in the back. Okay, I do not hold the microphone on Shabbat, but I think that you should be able to hear me. Okay, so obviously there's a lot going on. There's a lot happening in Israel. October 7th was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Unfortunately, we know about massacres. For 2,000 years, there have been many massacres. There have been pogroms. And of course, everything culminating in the Holocaust. But from October 7th, Israel is in a national trauma. That doesn't mean that we're unable to function. It doesn't mean that we're unable to cope with the situation. We have a lot of families that have been torn apart. We have a lot of families that have been uprooted. In fact, there are some 90% of the families in the community where I live that either have a husband or a son fighting in Gaza or in Lebanon at this point, or in Judea and Samaria. How many of you have heard of Judea and Samaria? How many of you have heard of the West Bank? How many of you have read about the West Bank in your Bibles? No, you haven't. Okay, well, you know what? Let me give you a little history, okay? And I'm guessing that this is a fairly educated audience. But anyhow, I usually go through a quick history of Israel. It's like a 7-minute history of Israel. Okay, I see someone looking at a watch now. Don't hold me to it, but I'm going to try. Okay. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Slavery in Egypt. Leaving slavery in Egypt. The Red Sea, crossing the Red Sea. Coming into the land of Israel. And when we came into the land of Israel, after 14 years, we came to a place called Shiloh. Shiloh, I know Americans would call it Shiloh. In fact, there are 65 cities or towns in the United States called Shiloh. It's a civil war battle called Shiloh. There was there's a hotel chain called Shiloh. There's a child of a couple of very misguided movie stars called Shiloh. There's even a Bible. There's even a prayer book, a Siddur, called Shiloh. But I live in the original Shiloh, where the tabernacle, okay, we'll call it Shiloh. right? You guys know a little bit of Hebrew, right? Right? You at least know words like hallelujah and amen. Okay, so that's good. So we'll call it Shiloh, which is the proper Hebrew pronunciation. And by the way, I wasn't born in Shiloh. Okay, I'm going to go off on a little tangent. Okay, the woman with the watch, please stop it right now. This doesn't count. This is a tangent. Okay, so I'm originally from a place called Brooklyn that you may have heard of. Okay, it always gets a laugh and always one hand waving. Okay, I see it. I see it. Okay, so I grew up in a family that was moderately traditional. But as I went to public school, and as a teenager, I believed that I was an atheist. In my 20s, I had a Jewish return to roots, and I came to the conclusion that I needed to be living in the land of Israel. So I moved to Israel. I moved to a place called Shiloh. Okay, so back to that. So that's where the tabernacle stood. That's where Joshua spoke to the Israelites, and Joshua said, "How long will you wait before coming to take possession of the land that the Lord God of your fathers has given you?" When he spoke those words, the Israelites responded. The 7 tribes that had not yet received their inheritance went out to claim their inheritance in the land of Israel. Near the end of the Shiloh period, which lasted 369 years as the capital of Israel, a woman named Hannah came to pray for a son. She came to the tabernacle. She poured out her heart in prayer. The son who was born from her prayers, she named Samuel. Samuel grew up into prophecy in Shiloh. He walked up and down the same rocky hills that my children walked up and down as they were growing up. And he was the one who would become the greatest of the judges and a prophet second only to Moses. And he would go on after the destruction of Shiloh to appoint the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. David unified the kingdom of Israel in Jerusalem, with its capital in Jerusalem. His son Solomon built the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, where it stood for several hundred years. Then it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who exiled a portion of the Jewish people to Babylon. And then sometime later, Ezra and Nehemiah came back to the land of Israel. They oversaw the rebuilding of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, where it stood for another several hundred years. And then we were exiled from the land of Israel, and the temple was destroyed by the Romans. The Romans renamed the land of Israel, or Judea as it was called also at that time. They renamed it Palestina, giving it a Roman derivative of the word Philistines, who were obviously another enemy of the Jewish people. The name Palestina stuck. It became known around the world, not Palestina, Palestine, it was called. For 2,000 years, it was called Palestine by whoever controlled it at that given time. That was the name that was used, except for the people of Israel, who were scattered around the world, living in perilous circumstances in many countries, succeeding in many countries in their lives. But eventually the persecution always came. But when didn't matter where we lived. Could be in Spain, we could be in Northern Africa, we could be in Europe, we could be in the United States. Wherever we lived, we always prayed 3 times a day to the land of Israel. In fact, my father-in-law, who grew up, okay, another tangent. My father-in-law, who was born in Israel, grew up in Israel, moved to America with his parents when he was 9 years old. He always told me that everyone called themselves Palestinians. The Jews called themselves Palestinians. But he said the Arab kids never wanted to call themselves Palestinians. They said, we're part of the Arab nation. What's this Palestinians? But then they discovered, sometime after 1948, they discovered, 48, when Israel was established again as a sovereign nation. So at that point, they still called themselves Arabs of the Arab nation. They didn't call themselves Palestinians. 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization is established because the Arabs weren't doing a very good job of making the Jews leave. That's when they started to call themselves Palestinians. Then 1967 comes. All of the Arab nations attack Israel, threatening to expel us and drive all the Jews into the sea. By the way, it's the Mediterranean Sea that they were talking about. You know, when you see these rallies in the United States or Europe, all these Muslims chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Well, aside from the fact that it rhymes, most of those people who are chanting that don't even know what they're talking about. They don't know which river, they don't know which sea. But because it rhymes and it's trendy, so they do it. That, of course, I'm talking about the average American college students. I'm not talking about the Muslims who are chanting it with them, because the Muslims know exactly what they're talking about. Anyhow, so 1967, Israel is attacked from all sides. At the end of that war, which came to be known as the Six-Day War, Israel recaptured the Golan Heights in the north. Israel recaptured the Sinai Desert and Gaza in the south. Israel recaptured Judea and Samaria. Samaria is where Shiloh is, by the way. Israel recaptured eastern Jerusalem, where the Holy Temples once stood and where the Western Wall is, which is actually just the retaining wall of the Holy Temple, of the Temple Mount. Israel recaptured all of those areas in 6 days, and on the 7th day we rested. It sounds to me like everyone's shocked. On the seventh day, we rested. Look, the seventh day technically was Erev Shabbat. It was on Friday. But I still think that God was sending a very clear message. On 6 days, you do what you need to do. On the seventh day, you rest. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War, Israel was caught by surprise. And a lot of people have compared the massacre in Gaza, in the Gaza region, on October 7th to the Yom Kippur War. That it came as a total surprise. Eventually, we recovered from that war. 1992, 1993, the Oslo Accords, the Oslo Peace Accords. Israel promises to set up 7 autonomous cities in Judea and Samaria for the people who had come to be called Palestinians. The Palestine Liberation Organization was given control over those areas and Gaza, all of Gaza. And they started to be called the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Liberation Organization was never wiped out, was never eliminated, it still exists. Anyhow, that was a foolish process, the most tragic process that ever could have happened. I remember there was an author named Sidney Zion many years ago who wrote an article that I read in the New York Post. And he said, Israel has done something that never has ever happened in history. It found a way to mass produce dumb Jews. And kind of a harsh statement, but I understand what he was talking about. It was the most foolish agreement that could ever have been signed. And all that it brought was terrorism, massive terrorism that afflicted all of Israel for the next 25 years, the next 30 years. And I could tell you, you could take a walk in my neighborhood and you come to house after house after house after house that has lost children in terror attacks. A 17-year-old boy. Next house, 16-year-old boy. Next house, a 19-year-old girl. Next house, a 3-month-old baby. This is what Israel has been dealing with for the past 30 years. And in fact, I myself was wounded in a terror attack. About 20 years ago, I was driving home from Jerusalem with my 3-year-old son, when suddenly the car was hit with a massive hail of bullets. When the bullets hit, the car went completely dead. I saw bullets whizzing past my eyes with tracer bullets. And then a bullet crashed into my left leg. Blood started flying all over the place. I turned around to my son, who was not making any sounds. And I looked at him and I asked him if he was okay. His eyes were staring straight ahead, wide open. His mouth was wide open. He looked like he was trying to scream or to cry, but no sounds were coming out. I figured he was just in shock and that I better just start the car and get moving. So I turned the ignition. The car wasn't starting. I shifted gears, trying everything I could, park, drive, neutral, 3, 4, 5 times, turning the ignition each time the car was not starting. Then suddenly the car started, and it started as if it had never had a problem starting before. I hit the gas. I drove 110 miles an hour to get to the next community up the road, which is called Ophrah. I pull up to the front gate of Ophrah. Now you have to understand that in Samaria and Judea, every Jewish community, and by the way, this is the way it was in Gaza before the Jews were evacuated by the Israeli government, every community has a metal gate in the front to keep out car bombers. Well, I pull up to the front gate, I stop the car, I couldn't get out because my leg was not in good shape, and I start shouting from the car for an ambulance. No one seemed to hear me, but there was a guard at the gate, and a young woman on the side of the road who was sitting right nearby. She starts jumping up and down, screaming, "Ambulance, ambulance, don't you hear?" At that point, everyone who was within sound's reach came running up to the car, including the gas station attendant from across the street. He ran up to the car, he ripped off my shirt, he wrapped up my leg to stop the blood flow. He said, "Don't worry, I'm also a paramedic. I know what I'm doing." And then he handed me a cell phone. He said, "Here, call your wife." I told my wife I've been shot in the leg. Hopefully soon an ambulance will be coming to take me to the hospital, and our son is okay. Well, about a minute later, an ambulance does pull up, and two paramedics leap out of the ambulance. One of them runs up to the car and starts unbuckling my son from the baby seat. He was 3 years old at that time. And then he starts shouting to the ambulance, to the driver in the ambulance, he's been shot also. He's been shot in the head. A bullet had gone into his head, we later found out, where the skull meets with the neck, causing a skull fracture and internal bleeding in the cerebellum. Well, they got to work on him. They wrapped his head with bandages. They put an oxygen mask on his face and connected it to an oxygen tank in the ambulance, put both of us on stretchers and took us to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, they get to work on us, 2 separate emergency rooms. And after about 20 minutes, the head surgeon comes up to me. He says, "David, I just want you to know that we're going to have to operate on both of you within the half an hour. It'll be the first of probably several operations. And I really hope your son is going to be okay. We're going to do our best." And then there was another man right next to him who says, "I'm the public relations director for this hospital. I just want you to know that you are the 1,000th victim of terrorism to be hospitalized in this hospital just in the past year and a half." I wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to do with that honor. He says to me, "I'm only telling you this because you are the 1,000th victim, and the media is massed outside this emergency room. They want to come in, they want to interview the 1,000th victim of terrorism and photograph you and your son, and I will keep them away. Don't worry, my job is to protect your privacy." I thought for a moment about this. And I thought of all the people who we knew who had been killed or wounded in terror attacks just in that past year. And I said, "You know what? You bring them in here. I have what to say to them." And I've been telling this story ever since. And I tell this story not because of my personal trauma or my family's personal trauma. And there are many families that have suffered far worse than us. But I tell the story because it's a story of miracles. I was shot in the left leg, even though the terrorist was shooting from the right side. It missed my right leg, which enabled me to drive my automatic car to get to the ambulance. The bullet that went into my son's head and through his neck missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. Well, those are the kinds of miracles that your average atheist will look at and try and rationalize away. But in Judaism, we understand that there are two kinds of miracles. There are nisim niglim and there are nisim nistarim, which means revealed miracles and hidden miracles. So the two miracles that I just described were hidden miracles. They're the kind of miracles that kind of take a spiritually trained eye to see how God is working in our lives. But there are also revealed miracles, like that fire on the mountain on Mount Sinai when Moses received the Ten Commandments, like the splitting of the Red Sea. On my 5th day in the hospital, I get a call from the car mechanic. He says, David, I just want you to know that we have the car. We've started ordering parts. There are 49 bullet holes in the car. It's going to be very difficult to fix, but we're going to do our best. So don't worry. I said, don't worry? Are you serious? I'm laying there in my hospital bed. My leg was attached to some device that was supposed to be prepared for plastic surgery that was soon to come. And then I was allowed to be wheeled in my wheelchair to my son in the intensive care unit once a day. He was sleeping most of the day because of the bleeding in the cerebellum. He couldn't lift himself up in his bed even. He had almost total memory loss. He didn't remember his sisters when they came to the hospital to visit him. I said, and you're calling me about a car? I don't care about the car anymore. Car's not important. He said, I'm only calling you because I have to ask you a question. Why can't we start that car? Now, I know that the car went completely dead when the bullets hit, and I know I tried over and over to get it to start. It wasn't starting, and then it suddenly started, as if it had never had a problem starting before. I got to that ambulance, we got to the hospital, and we survived. Now, I have a personal confession to make to you, and I'm not Catholic. I've been a believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for over 30 years. Over 35 years. But up until that very moment, I still had some of that, shall we call it, New York City skepticism when it came to personal miracle stories. But I'm not a skeptic any longer because we just lifted up on God's wings to get us to that ambulance. And I knew after that moment that God had planted a mission in me. Something was different. Something was different. I felt that I had been touched by the Shekhinah, by God's divine presence. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it, frankly. I only discovered it a few weeks later. 3.5 weeks later, my son came back from the hospital. I had just come back a day before. And he was walking, well, thank God he was walking again, but he was walking screaming in the middle of the night, several nights in a row. My wife and I realized that there was deep psychological trauma in that child. We had no idea how you heal trauma in a 3-year-old. But we started to think about it. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in my living room, in the corner of the living room. I'm reading a book, and I hear my son. My son was on the other side of the living room, sitting in a big toy car that we had, and he was talking to himself. So I perked my ears up, I looked in his direction, and he looked at mine. He looked at me, and he said, he picked up a doll that was sitting in the seat in the car, and he said, this is the Abba. Abba, which means father in Hebrew. he had a hole in his leg, which indeed I did, even after plastic surgery. And then he picked up another doll and he said, this is the little baby. He shot head. I burst into tears at that moment. And looking back, it was for several reasons. Number one, it was the first moment, 5.5 weeks after the attack, it was the first moment that he had expressed anything verbally about the attack. Secondly, I realized this is how you treat trauma in young children. Somehow using toys or some sort of play therapy. That's how I understood it at that moment. And that's when I decided to start the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund for the purpose of healing the trauma of the terror victim children and helping them to move on with their lives. 20 years later, we have 2 campuses with over 3,000 children of a variety of ages. We blend therapy with education in treating trauma in young children. And everyone needs it to varying degrees. There is not one child in our region, and now in the whole country, I think I could say, that does not have either a family member or a friend or a neighbor or a teacher who was killed or wounded in a terror attack. The trauma is that great. The PTSD is that intense. And then after the 7th of October, the whole country is traumatized. And we were immediately contacted by the Israeli Defense Ministry that was frantically trying to move families, to evacuate families from the Gaza region after that massacre, and moving them to the center of the country. Families from the north of the country have also been moved to the center of the country for their safety. But after that massacre, so the Defense Ministry said, we have to be in touch with you because you know how to deal with trauma. And indeed, we've been doing it for 20 years. We use music and art, small animals, horses. We have a horse farm for therapeutic horseback riding. We use horticulture therapy, multisensory safe room therapy, which is known as snoozling therapy, sports therapy, every therapy you can imagine that works. And now we had to expand our programs to enable mobile therapists to go out to those families and treat them with whole family therapy. So we've been working 24/7 since October 7th, and it has been quite intense. Israel is fighting a war in Gaza and soon in Lebanon, and possibly also in Judea and Samaria, and of course the Red Sea with the Houthis, and possibly Iran. Now, Iran is the head of the octopus. You have to understand this. And we'll see whether we end up getting to them in the course of this war. It's very expensive to have a war, and the loss of life is enormous. And we've had neighbors already who've been killed in this war. But we have no choice After October 7th, when heads were beheaded, people were beheaded, bodies were burned alive, 250 hostages were taken, including a baby, that's just several babies, but one that's still in captivity and just had his first birthday in captivity in the tunnels of Gaza. Horrible, horrible crimes. But meanwhile, we're being judged at The Hague. Anyhow, let's stay focused here. Okay, we're here. I'm here on a mission. And it's a mission that I believe includes everybody. Everybody who understands that God's providence is on the land of Israel. Everyone who understands that what's happening today is critical as well for Judeo-Christian civilization to survive. So we have a couple of short videos I'd like you to see that tell you a little bit about what we do, how it works.
Here
and of course, it doesn't include Gaza.
The hills of Shiloh, we meet.
But because that just happened. But I think you'll get the idea, and hopefully you will want to stand with us. Okay.
It is a survivor of a terror attack in Israel who is working hard to make Israel safer, healthier, and happier.
Almost exactly 20 years ago, I was driving back from Jerusalem with my 3-year-old son sitting behind me in the baby seat. Suddenly, the car was hit by a hail of bullets that were firing at the car. There were terrorists. I got shot in the leg. My son got shot in the head. Incredibly, we survived, yes. When I saw all of the psychological trauma that he was going through, I had this vision of a therapeutic, educational campus that would heal the trauma of terror victim children, restore the lost innocence to their lives, and at the same time, rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel. At that moment, actually, I decided to start what would eventually become the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. They come to school, the first thing they see is this big petting zoo and a music playground and a music studio and and all types of creative informal therapies.
סתם עוזר לחיות, מטפל בהם. אוהב את הארנבים, את העיזים, את האוגרים, נראה את כל החיות.
של פינת החי נותנת מקום בטוח לילדים. באמת, ילד שמגיע לפה, נפגש עם הבעלי חיים, מלטף, מטפל, מנקה, מוליך את הכלבה, נפגש עם מקום בטוח, נותן לו שלווה ככה.
בעבר עבדתי עם ילד עם משפחה שכולה, איבד את אחיו באחד הפיגועים הקשים. אותו ילד במהלך השנים לא דיבר כל כך, במפגשי הרכיבה השבועים פה נפתח קצת יותר, דיבר וסיפר קצת יותר על תחביביו. מעריך שדי עזרנו לו באותם שנים.
Really friendly with the Arabs coming next to us. So sometimes they burn sometimes they burn stuff, and that's really scary, but that's life.
What makes you feel
Strong?
confident? What makes you feel strong?
The one who lives up. God Almighty that saves on us and everyone.
We have on the same campus, in addition to the boys' school and the girls' school, we have a formal therapy center, which is called Mifgash, the meeting place in English. And there we have the formal therapies.
Yeah, I just went into school and I'm having fun. I'm having friends and I'm studying good and I like the classes here.
it's fine for me.
יש ממש מחקר שהראה שכל שקל שהשקענו בילד עד גיל 6, אם לא השקענו את השקל הזה, זה יהיה 15 שקלים בגילאים הגדולים יותר. באמת הגילאים האלה הם קריטיים, הגיל הרך והבית הספר היסודי, זה מאוד מאוד משמעותי. הייתה לנו פה משפחה לפני כמה שנים, למדו אצלנו 3 בנות, אבא נפצע בפיגוע ירי, עברו תקופה מאוד לא קשה. ואצל הבנות ראינו מגוון של התנהגויות, גם קושי להתמודד, לפעמים התנהגות סיכונית. הבנות האלה הצטרפו לקבוצת תרפיה שנתרמה על ידי קרן שילה לילדי ישראל, ואחרי תקופה של התרפיה ראינו איך ההתנהגויות הסיכוניות יורדות, איך הילדות נפתחות, משתפות יותר, מגלות חוסן ומצליחות להתמודד עם המציאות החדשה של המשפחה. ראינו בזה ברכה גדולה.
אני חושבת שנערה שיש לה חוסן, שמגבלת פה את הכלים להתמודדות, היא נערה שהחיים שלה הרבה יותר מיטיבים איתה.
בתחילת כל שנה דוד יוצר קשר ואומר, אתם תחלמו, אנחנו נגשים. במדינת ישראל היום יש סבסוד מאוד נמוך לכל סוגי הטיפול. ממש הטיפולים הם גירעוניים, הם לא מכסים את עצמם, ואם אתה באמת רוצה שהמקום יהיה מקצועי ומשמעותי וייתן את הטיפול כמו שצריך, אין דרך לכסות את זה רק על ידי הביטוחים הרפואיים של קופות החולים. ואז אנחנו נשארים עם פער מאוד מאוד גדול, והרבה מרכזים טיפוליים נסגרים. ממש כל שנה מספר מרכזים נסגרים, ואנחנו בזכות קרן שילה לילדי ישראל לא רק מצליחים לתת את הטיפול המשמעותי הזה בצורה מאוד מאוד מקצועית, אלא גם לפתח מענים יותר רחבים.
We're big Zionists. We believe in our right to be here in the biblical heartland. We believe strongly that we can achieve through the sweat of our hands, through our own hard work. But the reality is that, people around the world, there are a lot of people around the world who understand the importance of Israel's return to its biblical heartland. There are a lot of people around the world who care about the children and realize that the way to help Israel is to help the children. So we have people all over the world who stand with us in what we're trying to accomplish here and what we are accomplishing here. Truly we're able to turn the pain of terrorism into miracles with the help of God and with the help of all of our friends around the world.
Former mayor of Shiloh, Israel, and the founder of Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, David Rubin, joins us now. David, I want to just get your thoughts on these images we're seeing, these 2 newly released hostages, elderly women, 79 and 80 years old. Of course, that makes a total of 4. What are your thoughts?
A total of 4 and about 225 to go. Look, Hamas is looking for a public relations plus for them, but the fact is that they committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And I don't use those words lightly, Charles. I've been on so many Fox News programs and other news programs who have been talking about this for years, about the terrorism from Hamas, the terrorism from Fatah, the terrorism from Islamic Jihad, and it's time to put an end to it. And most Israelis are in agreement that it's time to put an end to it. And thank you for mentioning that I'm the founder of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. We have a website, israelchildren.org. People can go to that website, israelchildren.org, and stand with us, because the things that we have seen are so horrible. The trauma in thousands upon thousands of children is going through the roof. The appeals, the references for treatment are skyrocketing. This is a very, very serious issue that's going to be with us for years, even if we are very successful in this war, and I hope we will be.
To that point, it's really it's heartbreaking that the children living through this, watching this, knowing about this, seeing what happened to relatives, seeing what happened to neighbors, what happened to friends. You've experienced this over and over again. Is it possible to truly rid all of the trauma out of someone who sees this at such a young age?
It's not so easy.
Yeah.
It's not so easy. I could tell you, from my family alone, I could tell you from the hundreds, even thousands of terror victims who we've worked with. It's very, very difficult. The trauma never totally goes away, but the children learn to contend with it. We use music therapy and art therapy and horses and small animals and sports therapy and horticulture therapy. All of these therapies together are intermediaries that help the therapist to help the child. And we have whole family therapies because if one child is wounded in a terror attack, then the whole family is affected. So again, I encourage people to go to israelchildren.org and stand with us at this time.
Yeah, I'm on your website. I went there earlier, and it's truly informative. To your point, everyone should go there because this is not just an appeal, but we see what you're asking for donations from. I like this series of videos: the attack, the answer, the results. And again, you lived through this, and I think maybe to educate the public, because I'm not sure people understand the depth of the horror.
The trauma is so deep, Charles. So deep. And as you pointed out accurately, it never totally goes away. But through the therapeutic programs, we help the children to learn to contend with it and to move on and move forward in their lives.
David Rubin, God bless you. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
And I hope one day soon
Thank you,
under
Charles.
better circumstances. Thanks.
Have the rest of the worship team just come up and get ready. We're going to be taking up an offering for David Rubin and for his organization, really. There's so many thoughts in my mind. I'm not here to do another teaching. It's hard to hear me, somebody said. What's that mean? Turn in a circle? Wrong microphone? Yeah, but which one? He doesn't know. Okay. All right, how's it? Pretty good? Okay.
Yeah, I think he spoke from the heart. He made his appeal. And I know that he's speaking to people who understand the import of all this. So let's just have a word of prayer, and you don't make the checks out to Beth Messiah. There's always one or two that do that, and then we have to come back around, and Barb Richards has to work with it. So you want to make them out to Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, okay? If you're going to give